Gorl the Slard Lord, and a Githyanki general named Sireka. I trapped them in a demon stone, where they would fight for all eternity. Now you bring me word they've broken free.
Forgotten Realms Demon Stone is a third-person hack-and-slash action game developed by Stormfront Studios and published by Atari in fall 2004. Three outcasts find themselves caught in an orcish invasion of the Kingdom of Damara. Forced together and driven into the depths of the earth, the trio inadvertently shatter the eponymous Demon Stone and unleash two dueling interdimensional warlords upon Faerun. Rannek the Ranger, Ilias the Mage, and Jai the Rogue must conquer both their inner fears and their mistrust of each other in order to redeem themselves and deliver Damara from the darkness. The game is very similar to Stormfront's previous title, The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, with a semi-fixed camera following a small group of heroes chopping their way through hordes of monsters to earn golden experience points before they shuffle on to the next level. The game is also very loosely based around the AD&D 3.5 edition rules, with the three character classes able to gain levels and specialised abilities from the rulebooks, and use some of the iconic spells and items of the setting.
Gauntlets of ogre power.
You're the fighter.
Upon its release, Demon Stone received mixed reviews from critics, with praise for its accessibility, graphical fidelity, and cinematic storytelling, but heavy criticism for its simplistic and shallow gameplay compared to similar titles, the absence of multiplayer or co-op functionality, and lack of replayability. The PC port of the game scored worse than the console versions, though it was common at the time for PC gaming publications to give harsher reviews. Demon Stone was the last Forgotten Realms title Stormfront would work on before their closure in 2008. A sad end to the developer responsible for the original AD&D titles of the golden age of CRPGs. Despite the hack and slash tag, Demon Stone has virtually nothing in common with the Diablo clones and dungeon crawlers associated with the genre. Games like Demon Stone, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King are more closely related to the old side-scrollers of the late 80s and early 90s. The three character classes will be fighting together for most of the game, and the player can switch between them in real time whilst the AI takes over your companions. You'll have to get used to doing this a fair bit, as some fights will require you to switch between the fighter for general combat, the mage for disrupting ranged attackers or bosses, and the rogue for taking care of some other task while the two other heroes distract your foes. Demon Stone is completely linear, with an extremely restrictive camera that, on very rare occasions, will ease up to let the player find a bit of extra gold, or a side route to let the rogue get the drop on enemies. You'll need that gold to help you keep pace with enemies, as although the team can purchase new gear and character upgrades between levels, enemies' health and damage is constantly being scaled up as well. None of the upgrades are very interesting, just better armor, additional combo moves, or more effective blocking, so the items and skills you can buy feel more like mandatory upgrades than exciting new abilities. In fairness, the three classes do have somewhat different innate strengths and weaknesses. The mage is most effective at ranged combat, the fighter has the most effective basic combat attacks, and the rogue can slip in and out of preset patches of shadow to instantly kill regular enemies. The AI is usually okay at fighting cannon fodder enemies, and even does a passable job of performing stealth kills as the rogue, but it can easily get stun locked or break its pathfinding trying to get to health drops. Luckily, the AI combatants seem to be immortal until the player regains control, otherwise the game would probably be unfinishable. The rogue feels the most unique out of the three heroes, as her ability to jump means there are more scenarios in which she has to break off from the main party and do her own thing, and the game likes to give her some solo stealth sections every couple of missions. When controlling the warrior, you'll just be doing a lot of mindless clicking or blocking, and on the frequent occasions the mage's AI stumbles and you have to take over for them, you'll just be throwing up a magic shield, charging a ranged attack, throwing up the shield again, and repeating until you have a reason to take over the warrior or rogue again. This gets a bit repetitive early on in the game, and it only gets worse later on. In theory, a game's difficulty curve would match the player's ability to master the game's control scheme and mechanics, but Demon Stone's later missions only highlight the wonky controls and brainless combat. The game can get quite tough, and I died a few times later in the game, especially when it becomes difficult to keep track of which enemy is attacking you and whether you're supposed to be blocking or running away from that specific attack. But I didn't feel like I'd conquered those fights, so much as the dice happened to go my way on that particular try. The game's campaign is extremely short, clocking in at maybe 4 hours by my reckoning, and after that there's absolutely nothing to do. Most games of this type try to add replay value with unlockable modes, new costumes, hidden characters, maybe a secret level or something. The game gives you access to the infamous Drizzt Do'Urden for one level, so I was surprised he wasn't unlockable in New Game Plus. There's no real reason to replay Demon Stone on a higher difficulty mode, other than desperation or the lack of anything else to play. This game screams, rent me for a couple of nights and then return me to Blockbuster. I suppose someone who played this game as a kid might have some nostalgic connection to it, but anyone else should try looking into The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King if they like games of this sort from the PS2 era. You might also be interested in the Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance games, or EverQuest, if you want a more Diablo-esque console dungeon crawler. Demon Stone comes from that awkward point in gaming when they couldn't quite decide between stylization and photorealism. So you have slightly cartoonish dragons and Slard, next to semi-realistic humanoids with what look like face-mapped textures. The game really pushes the limits of the awesome computational power available in 2004 with a few swinging locks of hair. Eat your heart out, physics. But overall, I'm sure the artists and animators did their best with the resources they had. They clearly put a lot of work into Jai's lithe physique, and the enemies are generally pretty readable when running about on screen. There are quite a lot of bombastic particle effects flying around in some levels, and the jungle level was probably quite tough to optimize on the consoles. The game sometimes drops the ball when trying to show large open spaces, resorting to ugly 2D skyboxes that probably didn't look as incongruous on someone's CRT TV at the time. Hell, Halo 3 was still doing this in 2007. I should point out that the PC version of the game I got from Good Old Games seems to have performance issues when shadows are enabled, so most of the footage you see probably looks a bit flatter than it should. I didn't have any other problems with the port besides the terrible controls, but whenever purchasing a game on GOG.com, you should always remember that their definition of compatible with Windows 10 is usually in the most literal sense of the phrase. And sometimes even that isn't true without extra tinkering. Just a word of warning when it comes to other games on their store. Devin St. Clair was the character art lead on the project, and there are some really interesting early concept sketches for Zhai that make her look like a doppelganger or something. I wonder what that was all about. Maybe they were originally meant to be used in another project. Ilias is passable, Kelban Blackstaff looks like a random desert sage, and the two main antagonists are not particularly imposing. Ranek has that grizzled 90s anti-hero look down pat.
When I awoke, almost everyone I knew had been killed.
Explains the death wish.
Actually, I think Demon's Stone came at the time when games were starting to enter that darker, edgier, sexier phase of puberty. If the game had come out a year later, I expect Zhai would have even less clothing, and Ranek would have even more stubble. Renowned fantasy artist Todd Lockwood, who you might recognise from some of the D&D books or Drizzt novels, also did some nice promotional art for the game. Sound effects are adequate, though the clash of steel and parting of flesh seemed a bit muted. It also would have been nice to have more variations on the melee combat sounds and enemy death cries, since you'll be hearing so much of them in such a short period of time. Your AI companions will often shout at you during combat, sometimes useless advice like warning you they're low on health, but at other times giving you critical information regarding how to overcome a simple puzzle or boss mechanic.
Shoot at the other balcony.
This is a nice touch, and definitely preferable to text pop-ups or glowing waypoints. The soundtrack was composed by the game's audio lead, Rob Mills, who has very kindly provided the score for free on his personal website. It's pretty good for a PS2 hack-and-slash game. I liked the Gemspark mines for the ambience, and the main theme is worth listening to as well, especially when the Elvish chorus come in.
If left free, either of them will annihilate Faerun. You must entrap the pair again, together, in a new Demon Stone. I know of one that's suitable.
The Bloodstone lands encompass much of Faerun's cold northern landmass. They are rich in natural resources, deriving their name from the Bloodstone gems mined from the area, but also rich in danger for the civilized peoples of these lands. Kingdoms like Damara face not only the usual concerns of war and internal strife, but also periodic invasions of goblins and giantkin. In Demon's Stone, Damara finds itself under attack from armies of orcs, goblins, and even a dragon. But, as often happens, these chaotic hordes quickly come to blows with one another. Enter Ranek, a disgraced ranger from Nesmi, seeking to escape his shame. Ilias the mage, disowned by his father for refusing the call of knighthood, and Zhai, a half-drow, half-wood elf rogue with no people to truly call her own. Drawn together by what seems the whims of fate, the three heroes flee the flames of a dragon into the bowels of the earth, where they accidentally free two great evils, a Slard Lord and a Githyanki tyrant, whose thirst for domination is dwarfed only by their mutual hatred. The two overlords begin gathering their armies and scouring the Bloodstone lands for weapons to use in their ancient feud. The Archmage Kelban Blackstaff sends the heroes on a quest to forge a new Demon Stone and cage the beasts once more, before all of Damara lies in ruins.
Find the Demon Stone. Use my portal. Now! You mustn't fail!
Much was made of R.A. Salvatore's role in writing the story of Demon Stone. Salvatore is of course famous for his best-selling Drizzt books, and has contributed significantly to the lore of the Forgotten Realms setting, second only perhaps to Ed Greenwood, at least in the minds of the general public. This wasn't the first time video games had touted the involvement of a famous author or scriptwriter, and it probably won't be the last. The general consensus, with which I agree, is that there's very little evidence this adds much to video game writing. When people talk about great stories or writing in video games, it's never Rhianna Pratchett, for example, but names like Chris Avellone, Amy Hennig, or Sam Lake. Computer games, whether CRPGs or linear cinematic action experiences, are so different to novels or TV episodes that it's tough to translate skills from one medium to another. People are constantly misidentifying who worked on a specific character or line of dialogue in a game, or citing a character as an example of good writing when they really just had a very good voice actor. It's possible certain types of games are better vehicles for talented writers than others, perhaps adventure games, for example, but Demon's Stone certainly isn't one of them. The best you can say about Demon's Stone's writing is that, like the gameplay, it's adequate. You can almost see the checkboxes being ticked as the story progresses. The heroes start off as tortured loners.
A fellow outcast.
At least your neighbors didn't fear you. My whole life, nobody turned their backs for a second.
Smart elves.
But come to empathize with each other and overcome evil through the power of friendship.
It seems you have a problem.
Because we're not alone anymore.
And if you want this sword, you'll have to take it.
Nothing particularly interesting or surprising happens over the course of the 4 hours. It's not bad writing, it's just there. Like someone did the bare minimum to pass their creative writing course.
What?
In fairness, some people will counter that Salvatore himself is not a very good writer, and he can only write power fantasies for adolescent boys about killing monsters and touching girls. But I think a reasonable critic would still admit his novels are a better display of his talents than Demon's Stone. It's easy to sneer at Demon's Stone. It's a game of limited scope and ambition, having aspired to be an unremarkable and inoffensive hack and slash, and meeting that goal. There are certainly better hack and slash games out there, whether you're a fan of fast-paced slicing and dicing, slower, more measured sword-fighting action, or simple and accessible dungeon crawling. But it is unusual to have a fully 3D third-person game set in the Forgotten Realms, especially one that revolves around a small cast of comic book-style protagonists. So there is some novelty value in experiencing the setting from a different perspective. And if you're nutty about a certain Drow Ranger, this is the only game that lets you wield Twinkle and Icing Death and defend Mithril Hall from trolls.
Shadows.